I'm going to talk about what I do. I'm a media artist and painter, and I live and work in New York City. My paintings are based on images that I collect from online military archives, news, and other documentary outlets on the internet. Through a process that incorporates research, decontextualization of the source image, and performative painting, I examine themes relating to the apocalyptic and the sublime at the junctions of cultural and media politics. In his recently published book, The University of Disaster, Paul Virilio argues that the particular threats we are dealing with today are a direct result of the triumphs of late 20th century technologies. Virilio goes on to describe what could be called the apocalyptic sublime condition, which occurs wherever there is a sharp discontinuity between what is expected and what is perceived. The apocalyptic sublime condition is a metaphysical state of a combined awe and terror in face of immense natural or supernatural forces, and particularly here, man-made or human-influenced events where technology goes terribly awry. My affection for the directness, immediacy, and autonomy I associate with painting may at first seem odd in light of my interest in the various products of distance-enhancing vision technologies that I collect online. Interestingly, many assume that the purpose of both technoscientific and journalistic photography is to provide access and awareness through a process of making visible. In fact, what such technologies and approaches offer instead are extremely convincing illusions of proximity, which we all buy into in some way or another. The gaps between our first-hand experiences and these representations of reality remain. The discontinuity or dissonance generated by these gaps feeds into and characterizes our 21st century apocalyptic sublime condition. While media narratives may inculcate in us a false sense of proximity to realities we haven't experienced, I believe that painting can inhabit and activate the gaps between first-hand experience and the kind of visual data we consume 24/7 through our televisions and browsers. Hence, I am suggesting that rather than provide a bridge, art agitates within the gaps. Art functions best when acting as a gap enhancer. The term apocalyptic sublime is an expression I borrowed from the art historian and critic Christopher Phillips, currently a curator at the International Center of Photography in New York City, who so characterized a series of landscapes I'd completed in the late 1990s. He wrote that in these paintings, the illuminist celebration of transcendental landscape gives way to the 20th century encounter with the apocalyptic sublime. The paintings to which he was referring are based on then recently declassified United States government photographs and film stills of Cold War-era nuclear tests carried out in the southwest of the US and the Pacific. Between 1995 and 1999, under President Clinton, the Freedom of Information Act was amended to allow the release of previously classified national security documents, which initiated the digitization of tens of thousands of hours of historical film footage of atomic testing. This material was slowly and laboriously uploaded by the military to its publicly accessible online archives throughout the late 90s, which is how I became aware of them. It was through this project that I first engaged the problem of technologized information as a subject and subtext for painting, and through it I became increasingly engaged by the culturally and socially significant implications of mediation. One striking aspect of the US government's nuclear experiment was the fact that these monumentally lethal radioactive events had to be mediated in order to be enacted and observed. The extreme nature of these experiments, their obvious techno-political significance, as well as their overarching aesthetic appeal, gives us an extraordinary instance where the very real prospect of total annihilation and the immense wonder of the physical universe are intertwined and encapsulated in single images or clips. Perhaps, once these declassified atomic-era documents were released into the public domain, the apocalyptic sublime condition continued to enhance itself through representation alone, obliterating the very events depicted by superseding and replacing them, first in the public imagination and later in the writing and rewriting of official histories. Of course, picturing the enactment of beauty and horror in the vastness of the desert and on remote atolls resonates with the romantic tradition of landscape painting. Phillips identified this encounter in my work. He also saw in it the conflicts of a rapidly developing cultural moment where much was felt to be at stake, including the reabsorption of new technologies in terms of the desires and predilections of earlier paradigms and media. It wasn't just modes of image production and distribution that were changing. The parameters of visual art and cultural production in all mediums were shifting in response to the radical change in how we access and process information. The sublime apocalypse inherent to both 19th century landscape painting and the nuclear experiment was therefore a potent metaphor for what was happening socioculturally in terms of technology and media, as well as an apt description for what had been occurring quite literally on and under the ground. Since the late 90s, I've continued to forage for other kinds of apocalyptic sublime source images online, including the 2005 Paris riots, for which I found numerous images shot by onlookers and residents who uploaded them to social networking sites such as Flickr or to their personal blogs. I also spent some years focusing on climactic weather-related events such as the abundantly documented aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. The project, entitled Strange Weather, alludes to practical and metaphorical connections between geological and political weather. For many other projects, however, I suppress the contextualizing details specific to my source images. Sometimes it is more useful to discard such specifics. I am then left with an ambiguous, pared-down entity to work from, and a tension develops between what remains of the source image and what occurs on the canvas. Later, and most importantly, this ambivalence functions for the viewer as well. In the resulting paintings, pictorial aspects of the source are still present, but its anecdotal power to determine or guide interpretation has been stemmed. So for me, the primary distinction between a painting and its source image has to do with how we engage and experience different types of images through radically different delivery mechanisms and a variety of different physical and emotional circumstances. Generally speaking, traditional painting functions as a one-of-a-kind object meant to be experienced in physical space. Paintings are intimate documents. By contrast, the source images I use are endlessly reproducible immaterial entities that are easily decontextualized, reducible to bits, and treated as units of information with maximum distribution potential and high-gloss attraction. Aesthetically calculated to catch the eye, the source image, even when initially produced to evoke contemplation, is transformed by its mode of transmission into fodder for a narrative with endless turnover and few inducements to contemplation. And so I believe that while this stream of media images has developed into an ever-present narrative to our culture, artists have the capacity, through a number of options, painting among them, to manipulate the routinely occurring discrepancies or gaps in this narrative vis-a-vis the viewer. Attention is created and is fed by the freshly enhanced abyss between the two different types of experience engendered respectively by media image and artwork. Whereas the media narrative is accepted and absorbed passively, constantly, the contemplation of paintings is an engagement that the viewer chooses to experience, and where the viewer's effort and input, and perhaps their discomfort, is put in play. Los Angeles artist Mike Kelly put it beautifully in an interview he did with Glenn O'Brien in 2008. He says, "We're inundated with media sludge and white noise, but we can't see it or distinguish it." In a Virilio-esque turn, he declares that while we are surrounded by invisibility, art is there to make things visible. He says everybody should have a chance, should be taught to whack away at the white noise. Of course, this invokes a problem typically faced by art students and experienced more or less by artists everywhere: how to intervene in the cultural narrative at large, how to be relevant, how to make one's work matter, how to insert it into the larger picture. It took me years to see that this approach is completely backwards. It's not about finding a way to insert yourself into the world, but rather about doing something like what Kelly is describing, addressing the white noise by taking full possession of it and transforming it. My own choice, my line of attack, is to create a kind of détournement by remediating the dominant image narrative, the top-down representation of world events, by painting them. In the process, these representations of real-life events, and hence the world itself, become more relevant to me. Even so, any critical evaluation of my work on the apocalyptic sublime might suggest that the larger, more intellectually compelling questions that I raise are really those introduced by early 19th century romantics. But my inquiry reaches beyond 19th century preoccupations with nature and the sublime into the contemporary conflict with technology and technoscience, a la Virilio, with the way the media landscape has infiltrated our experience. This feeds into a whole set of developments in late 20th and early 21st century painting. For instance, there was a moment in the 1960s when a number of painters, notably Gerhard Richter and V.S. Selmans, dealt with the then dominant media, the photographic image, in a way that explicitly depicted the look of the photograph. Later, this look found a new feedback loop, reaching back to photography through mass media, and then back again to painting. I'm specifically thinking of photography that exploits history painting, but depicts scenes that usually blink fleetingly across our TV screens or browsers. My favorite example would be Thomas Roof's recent series called JPEG, based on low-resolution images found on the web. His source images range from the Twin Towers burning on 9/11 to some of the same declassified images I used for my nuclear landscapes, all blown up to monumental proportions. Their look is no longer that of a photograph, bitmapped or otherwise, but has come full circle back to painting, history painting. Roof's series especially makes sense, I feel, when regarded in relation to certain painters working since the photographic look of Richter, Selmans et al. For example, the painters Marlene Dumas and Peter Doig both source their work through the media and through photographs. Yet, the photographicness of their source imagery has been superseded, reconfigured by a sensual, more explicitly painterly trope, where photography or its look is transfigured and literally reclaimed by the hand. But back to the problem of the sublime. In his recent study on the end of representation, art historian James Elkins discusses the classical origin and various uses of the concept of the sublime up through Kant's example of a vast and stormy sea, where one overcomes the abject fear of drowning by conceptualizing one's distinctness from that sea. Then in the 19th century, the notion of the sublime gave rise to the image of the lone figure, separate and closed off from nature, thwarted, drowned by longing. We now face Kant's stormy sea in the form of mass media. It is man-made, technological, and cultural, and through it, ironically, we strive to close the gaps in our daily experience of the world. We live in awe of the media itself, which is manifold, vast, and unknowable. It is an abyss over which we have no real control, but which feeds and controls our lives. The media is Kant's stormy sea. We have encircled the earth with it, but unlike nature, it can't sustain us.